Hello there, thank you ever so much for this session. I'm Toby Milden and I'm a diversity and inclusion consultant. I work with heads of HR predominantly in the technology sector to help them create workplaces where everybody feels welcome and empowered and able to do their best work. So when I first left university, I spent the first half of my career working in technology. I was an IT consultant for Accenture. I worked in healthcare technology, and I was a technical project manager at the BBC. And that's how I first started getting involved in diversity and inclusion. I was working in the BBC's technology department with the chief operating officer, and he was concerned, along with the rest of the leadership team, that the technology department had a gender imbalance compared to the rest of the BBC, which was about 50-50 male-female. So I worked with the senior leadership team to create our diversity and inclusion action plan, realized that I really enjoyed working in this space. I did a sideways move and started working in the HR department, taking on other BBC departments like radio and all of the corporate services. I was then interested in really the business case of diversity and inclusion, because the business case at the BBC was very straightforward. It's a universal public service. Everybody deserves to see themselves reflected in the content that the BBC produces. But why would a commercial organisation be so interested in investing in diversity and inclusion? So I went to go and work for Deloitte within the HR department in the UK firm, looking at diversity and inclusion, but also Deloitte had much more of a focus on culture, creating a culture of respect and inclusion. Since leaving Deloitte, I've been working with a number of clients. I've written a book called Inclusive Growth, and the book is a practical framework for anybody running a HR department to implement diversity and inclusion in a sustainable way. And I've also got a regular podcast that comes out where I interview really interesting thought leaders on diversity and inclusion and business leaders who are implementing diversity and inclusion within their businesses. I've worked with a whole number of clients over the last couple of years in both the private and the public sector, and a whole manner of sizes from medium to really large international global businesses. One of the first questions I get asked is, well, what exactly is diversity and inclusion? How should we define it for the organization? And I often explain to my clients that diversity is a bit like an iceberg. You can see 10% of the iceberg above the waterline, and these could be our visible characteristics. It could be gender, it could be visible disability, it could be ethnicity. But actually, there's so much that makes us diverse that's hidden underneath the waterline. And these could be our invisible characteristics. Now, some of these invisible characteristics are protected by the Equality Act, which is the equality legislation within the UK. So somebody could have an invisible disability or long-term health condition, for example, like dyslexia. But actually, there's so many invisible characteristics that make us unique. It could be the type of educational background that you have, for instance, where you grew up in the country, the kind of family setting or environment that you come from. I think one of the risks when organizations talk about diversity and inclusion is they focus on like one particular group or characteristic. They might be focusing on women in leadership, for example, and not really considering other forms of diversity. And also, they're not really recognizing the intersectional nature of the human experience, that as human beings, we don't just tick one or two boxes, that we can tick, we have multiple identities and personalities. So somebody, for example, could be Black, disabled, and gay, and we need to be appealing to and speaking to all parts of their identity. The thing is, our words and our actions in the workplace create the culture or the environment that we work in with our colleagues. And there's two things that I want to talk to you about today, and that's bias and privilege. So let's first of all look at bias. So this is Verna Myers, who is the head of diversity and inclusion at Netflix. She's done a couple of really good TED Talks that I recommend watching. And her definition of bias is stories that we make up about people before we get to know them. Now, the topic of unconscious bias has been studied extensively over the last decade, and there's loads of academic literature and definitions out there about bias. However, I just really like the simplicity of Werner's definition. It is the stories that we're making up about people before we really get to know them. It's the assumptions or presumptions that we make about somebody before we really get to see their true self. Now, unconscious bias is created partly by the way that our brains are wired and also priming or social conditioning. So let me give you an example of the way that our brain is wired. The part of our brain that assesses danger is bigger, chemically speaking, than the part of our brain that rewards us. So we have this natural propensity to want to protect ourselves against losses more than we seek out gain. So imagine a decision that you're making. You know, you're in that decision-making process, you're going to naturally want to protect yourself against the loss rather than the gain that decision gives you. And then we end up with this thing called the sunk cost fallacy, for example. So if you're working on a large project and you're spending a lot of time, money, and energy on that project, and that project is failing or not really going anywhere, psychologically speaking, we're actually wired to want to put more money, more time, and more effort into that project to try and save it, to really protect ourselves against the embarrassment of a failed project than we are just to cut our losses and kind of just write the project off. Now, with priming, this is really what we're exposed to in the world, growing up and in adulthood, that really kind of informs how we kind of relate to other people. So it's the kind of stuff that you see on TV, the movies that you watch, the books that you read, the educational system, friends that you hang out with, parenting, all of that kind of thing. And that really kind of just shapes our view on the world. So the Harvard University have done some really fantastic research looking at bias, and they've done this thing called the Harvard Implicit Association Test. And you can do it for free online to try and identify some of the biases that you have. And I just want to share with you kind of my personal experience of that. So I took the test and I found out that I was moderately biased against disabled people, which is a really interesting result because I was born with a rare neuromuscular disability. I'm a wheelchair user and I need 24-hour care. My brother's actually got the same condition as me. I went to school with disabled kids. I've worked with disabled adults. So I've had my fair share of kind of working or living with disabled people. Yeah, I have this mild bias against disabled people. And when I looked into it, it's really a product of what I was exposed to. So the lack of disabled role models in business and politics, for example, how disabled people are portrayed in TV and film. And when I was at the BBC, we conducted some research and we found out that disabled people were more likely to be portrayed as villains, victims, and heroes than non-disabled people. So if you imagine those are kind of the signals that I'm receiving, because we're talking about the unconscious, those signals go into my other than consciousness self and, you know, really kind of run as a secret or silent script in the background, which does influence my interaction with people later on in life. Now, the Neuro Leadership Institute have created a really useful framework called the SEEDS model for being able to identify and categorize bias in our day-to-day work. This has been a really useful framework from them because there's about 140 different types of cognitive bias that affect our decision-making and our choices, which ultimately impact on other people. But the Neuro Leadership Institute have done a really good job of being able to kind of simplify that down into 5 key areas, which I'm going to walk you through now. So similarity bias is where we prefer what is like us over what is different. Effectively, we like to hang out with people that are just like ourselves. In the recruitment setting, we tend to hire in our own image. And what that means is that we create in-groups and out-groups. And we have an over-appreciation for the skills and abilities of people within our in-group, and then we overlook the skills and abilities of people that we consider to be in our out-group. Then we have expedience bias, and this is where we prefer to act quickly rather than take our time. Now, this bias is particularly prevalent when we are working under stress and under high cognitive load, and we end up taking all sorts of shortcuts to be able to make fast decisions. Have you ever replied to an email in haste that you regretted the next day, for example? Have you ever completed a task really quickly only to find that you had missed out a missing piece of the jigsaw? So when we're working under this high cognitive load, we are really prone to taking all sorts of shortcuts. And I often talk to clients who kind of say that there could be a combination of similarity and expedience bias when they're recruiting people, that they are naturally drawn to people that are just like themselves, but they also need to hire somebody really quickly. So they kind of open up their black book of contacts and trying to identify people that they can easily get into a position. Then we've got experience bias. Now, experience bias says that we take our perceptions to be the objective truth. It's like wearing a pair of virtual reality goggles. So your version of reality and your experience of watching this video right now is very different to somebody else watching this video, and it's very different to my experience as well. However, it feels really true and accurate to us. And then we end up making all sorts of decisions and choices based on what we falsely think is true. One of my favorite sayings in life is that we falsely think that we accurately see the world, and then we make decisions based on what we falsely think is true. And this kind of bias strikes when we're in creative situations or in problem-solving decisions. If you've ever heard people say things like, "That's just the way that we do things around here," or "I've tried that before, it didn't work, I won't be doing that again," we know that experience bias is at play. Now, with distance bias, we have a preference for what is closest to us, what is far away. And this is actually a good example of how our brains are wired. So scientists have found this part of the brain, which they're calling the proximity network. And the proximity network is how we categorize things in terms of distance, in times and space. And the brain lights up more when we are closer to something in terms of time and space. So we just have this natural propensity to kind of be to lean into things that are closest to us in terms of time and space. And this particular bias strikes when we're working with distributed teams, where you might have offices dotted around the country or around the world. And finally, we've got a safety bias, which I mentioned earlier. And this is where we tend to protect ourselves against losses more than we seek out gains. And if you remember, this is a good example, again, about how our brains are wired, that the part of our brain that assesses danger is bigger than the part of our brain rewards us. So we have this natural tendency to kind of play it safe, to be a bit risk averse. So this is a really good framework for you to be able to identify and categorize decisions when you're making choices and decisions that could ultimately impact on somebody else. Now, the thing is, shortcuts in our brain, known as biases, that they're just shortcuts. They're neither good nor bad, and they can help us in some situations, and they can hinder us in others. Sometimes unconscious bias training gets a bit of a bad reputation because sometimes people can mislabel themselves as racist or sexist or ableist if they find out that they have a bias towards or against a particular group of people. But don't forget that your biases are really influenced by the way that your brain is wired, but also through social conditioning or priming. Now, if you are crossing the road, for example, you will want to engage your intuitive gut reaction if you hear a loud screeching noise coming towards you to get out of the way. You don't want to overthink that situation. And if you wake up in the morning and you make yourself a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, again, that is an action that you do very intuitively. You don't want to overthink it, because biases really help us make fast choices. They help us conserve energy and kind of not use too much bandwidth when we're making decisions or choices. So this is a really good, there is a really good formula that you can use when you are making choices or decisions that could impact on other people, where bias could be at play. And it's the if this, then that formula. Now, if you work in technology, you've probably come across if this, then that when you're designing your requirements and you're testing your solutions. So first of all, identify a situation or a decision where bias could be at play. Then label that bias with one or two from the SEEDS model. So similarity, expedience, experience, distance, safety. Discuss this with somebody else, because it's very difficult to spot ourselves being biased. We can often spot it in other people or situations, but it's really hard to see it with ourselves. And then come up with some really simple mitigating action. So I'll give you an example. Imagine that you're going to do some job interviews later today. That's the situation. You could be worried about similarity bias. You would maybe want to discuss it with your line manager about ways of kind of overcoming that bias. And then a really simple mitigating action could be to deliberately spend 5 minutes with each candidate before you go into the formal interview to find common ground and similarities with them, because you know that you'll be naturally attracted to some candidates over others, because perhaps you went to a similar university or you come from a similar background. So now I want to talk to you about privilege. When I talk to privilege with my clients, I think the simplest way of explaining it is that it's like receiving gifts in life. You receive certain advantages in life that help you get ahead, help you, start a race a few steps ahead from other people. And some of these gifts are earned, like going to university and getting yourself a degree, which helps you get a good job. And some of them are unearned. So, where you're born, for example. So when I think about my own personal privileges or gifts in life, I was born in the UK with access to good healthcare, with access to good education. I'm male, I'm white, and I was born with these characteristics. When I think about some of the things that perhaps are not privileges, it was being born with the physical disability, growing up in a world that's designed for people who are physically able rather than those who have mobility needs. And it's that can kind of hold me back a bit. So a really useful model to think about when we're looking at privilege is the coin model of privilege. Now, what we've got is top of the coin. Now, top of the coin are advantages that you have that others don't have, things that you didn't earn. You have it because you happen to be you, or you did earn it. So I gave you an example earlier. I was born in the UK. I had access to good education and healthcare. I am white and I'm male. These are all kind of top of the coin privileges that that benefit me in life. We then have the bottom of the coin set of privileges, and this is really where we're talking about oppression. So these are kind of disadvantages that others don't necessarily have, or things that you didn't earn, or you have it because of who you happen to be. So, for example, my example would be that I was born with a genetic neuromuscular disability. That's something that I didn't have any choice over. Yet I live in a world that's been designed by people who are physically able, and that means that I have challenges in life, like not being able to get into shops and restaurants because there's steps instead of a ramp, for example. But the coin in the middle is really the system of inequality, the social structures that create and maintain that inequality. In other words, it's the kind of the racism and the sexism and the ableism that we have in the world. So what can you personally do about privilege? So first of all, it's really important that you raise your awareness. You know, there's really good books out there and videos and experts that do TED Talks and YouTube videos that you can go. So just go and educate yourself a bit about what privilege is and the impact that it has on equality in society. The second thing is don't take it personally, because if you remember, you know, top of the coin is the things that we're born with that we don't have any choice over. You know, I didn't have any influence over where in the world that I was born, and the fact that I was born in the UK and that I had good access to education and healthcare, for example, and that I was born male and white, for instance. But take personal responsibility to kind of listen to other people and their lived experiences, amplify other people to help them get their voice out, and speak out when you see negative effects of privilege happening in the workplace. And then take responsibility to mentor and coach and sponsor other people. You know, one of the biggest things or the most impactful things that organizations can do is to sponsor employees. So if you've got employees working in your organization who come from, you know, minority backgrounds, you know, a senior leader sponsoring that individual, helping them increase their professional network, helping them access opportunities is a really great way of leveling the playing field in any organization. I mean, if you're interested in anything that I've said today, I would suggest that the next best step is just to download the free chapter, the first chapter of my book, if you're interested. So if you just go to my website, milden.co.uk, and scroll to the bottom of the homepage, you could just put your name and email address in the box, and then I'll send you the first chapter of my book for free, which will help you on your journey for diversity and inclusion. And if you do have any questions, feel free to drop me a line. I'm very happy to kind of chat offline about anything that I've talked about in this video. And my email address is toby@milden.co.uk. Thank you for listening, and I hope you found this a really useful and helpful talk.